view of Rembrandt's life and his career using works of art from the NGA and from what we saw while we were abroad, with the idea that we're shifting gears to being focusing more and more on National Gallery work since we're here, but also the idea that this can provide a sort of a broader footing for each of the things that we sort of talked about before, right? Okay, very good. So with Rembrandt, right, as you know, it's 350 years since he was born in 1609, right? And he was something of a child prodigy. If you do the math, he's 19 in the self-portrait on your left, right? So, and that's not extraordinary in the Baroque period to be painting that early. But he's quite good, quite young, right? And he's a quick study as well. He goes from being sort of mediocre to being really good in the course of a couple of years. I think some of his earliest pictures are a little awkward yet. If those of you who were in Amsterdam saw one of them, that strange bluish historical picture, it's a very awkward picture, right? But that's only 2 years before the self-portrait on your left. And anyway, he, as we found out, just a tireless worker, never slows down. Questions came up with some frequency. How long did it take him to do all these things, you know? Because in addition to the paintings, of which there's around 300 that are currently accepted, 320 or so, that number's been as high as 700 or 800 in the past, but with the Rembrandt Research Project, it's around 325 or so. In addition to those, we've got over 300 etchings, right? 300 individual plates, many of which were worked through multiple states, right? So that's just 310 individual pieces of copper. That's not counting things like the way in which he altered plates, like, and maybe we'll talk about Rembrandt etchings next week, right? But the way in which, hey, would you guys like a etching demo? Because Mary's teaching etching across the hall right now. I mean, not tonight, but maybe we'll set up something to have a little how to make an etching plate demo. I'll talk to her this week and see if that works out. Maybe have you pop into her class. And some of the people, Dina's over there, right? Maeve is over there, I think, as well, from that class. So, okay, 300 plus. And then there's about 1,000 drawings, right? So, I mean, he's tirelessly working. And one of the things that it becomes obvious from his paintings is that not only is he tirelessly producing new imagery, but he's also, when it comes to working the individual images, he's also sort of tirelessly working them, right? Just getting into the surface and playing with them. And that's the whole issue with the states on the prints, right? Is he's in there and he's scrubbing around. And so when we look at both of these, there's the sense that there's this dialogue with the medium that's going on, that one of our curators talked about him being very performative in the way that he paints. And I think that's really was a nice way of putting that the painting becomes this sort of record of his work. Didn't the Rasher article kind of talk about that, right? Or maybe it was Nadine Orenstein's article in his etchings, sort of talked about the fact that Rembrandt's messiness gave us insight into how he works, right? And it sort of left these traces of how he works, right? So he's from the city of Leiden, right? We didn't get down to Leiden. The museum in Leiden is closed right now for renovation. His father ran a mill, was a miller. So he's a poor miller's son, or working class miller's son. And that lower class or middle class, working class upbringing has often been used by biographers, going back to some of his earliest biographers, has been used to explain certain elements of his work. His preference, for example, for rustic subject matter, right? For images of poor people. In his drawings, in his etchings, in his choices of biblical stories, right? But also his rough manner of painting, being rustic, right? That a lot of people said, well, he's the son of a miller and all of that. this is why, right? It also led to certain mythologies about his pictures. The degree to which both of these, excuse me, both of these have been said to be his father's mill at one point or another in their history, right? The one on the left is one of his very earliest landscape prints. You couple that with that it's a mill, and people have just autobiographically popped things into this. It's got to be Dad's mill, right? And this one on the right, which is one of only 7-ish landscape paintings by Rembrandt. We've got it downtown, right? It's back on view now, too. So we'll see it this weekend. But the mill on the hill, not particularly realistic, raised up on a hill, having also this idea that it's his dad's mill, right? No proof whatsoever. But through the 19th century, a lot of these were labeled as having autobiographical content, right? So no proof for either of these. Now, Leiden was an important university town. Most prominent university in the Low Countries at the time was in Leiden. And that turns out to be important for Rembrandt as well because he enrolled as a student there when he was 14 years old. That's, enrollment age was lower, right? So it's not that he was some sort of genius, right? In fact, we saw one of his handwritten letters in Amsterdam. And one of the things that the curator told us is, well, at least it proves he's not all that smart. Because it's like grammatical errors and stuff, right? He's not lettered, I think is the best way of putting that. Although he's quite intelligent, but he's not grammatically gifted, right? So he enrolls as a student at the University of Leiden. Matriculates is the best word for that, and pretty much drops out quickly. And the reason he withdrew was to study art. Because university then did not have majors like we have now. You went for liberal arts education, right? And the liberal arts then were, the 7 liberal arts, right? Rhetoric, mathematics, etc. And not like what we teach now in our liberal arts core or anything. So you didn't go for a degree, per se, right? A degree in economics or anything like that. Certainly not a degree in art. So he withdrew to study art, and the way you studied art in Rembrandt's time was the apprenticeship system. And Rembrandt had 2 different masters, right? One of them doesn't get as much talk, Jacob van Swanenberg. The second one gets a lot more talk, and that's Peter Lastman. But for Rembrandt, both of them are important because both of them spent a hunk of their career in Italy. And for us looking back at the 17th century in the Netherlands, it's important to remember the degree to which everybody looked up to Italy. Right? Italy was sort of the standard bearer in this period. And it's the legacy of the Renaissance, right? That artists do things right in Italy, right? And society does right by the artists in Italy. So it's important that both of his masters have a really strong Italian connection. Right? And at one point, Rembrandt will be asked, why don't you go to Italy and study? And he says, I don't have to, because there's plenty of stuff in my own backyard. Right? So while he goes to study art, it's his father that sends him to Amsterdam in 1622 to apprentice as a painter. Right? So he's now still only 16 years old, 2 years out of university. He's going to continue his training in Amsterdam. And the artist that he goes to Amsterdam to train under is Peter Lastman. And we saw this picture in The Hague. Emily bragged about having recently just got it, right? They only added this to the collection in January of this year, right? So it's a really recent acquisition. It was not there when I was there in October, right? And it was right before the entrance to the Rembrandt show. It's kind of poorly lit. I used their picture because mine had this big old shadow across John the Baptist's head. You couldn't even see him, right? So When he goes to Amsterdam to study, he chooses an artist who is not only has been to Italy, which is important for Rembrandt and for artists, and for Rembrandt it's important because Rembrandt has ambition. Right? One of the things we're going to talk about with Rembrandt tonight is the degree to which ambition drives his career. Right? He has ambition to be a great artist. And by great, not only financially successful, reputable, but also be perceived as being noble. Right? This is a really important part of Rembrandt's career, is his attempts to be perceived as a noble artist, a man of status. Right? So Lasman is the most important painter in Amsterdam in the 1620s. And in addition to that, he's almost exclusively a history painter. Historical biblical scenes, mythological scenes, which was perceived in art theory around Rembrandt's time. And it wasn't art, there wasn't only one way of looking at art, right? But the dominant trend was to view history painting as the most important. We've talked about that a number of times. So Lasman's a history painter. He's been to Italy. He's the most important guy in town, and Rembrandt becomes an apprentice with him. That probably wasn't easy, right? I can imagine that there are a lot of people clamoring to be Lasman's pupil, and you can only take on so many at a time. So Rembrandt must have already been sort of evidencing some talent. We don't have any paintings from this early, right, when he's 16. But certainly he would have attracted their eye, and even when he's in his mid-20s, he's already attracting the eye of other people, right? Sorry, not even mid-20s, early 20s, right? So here with St. John the Baptist, right, it's a pretty straightforward and easy picture to read. Baptist is in the foreground with the followers around him, listening to him as he preaches. The composition frames on either sides, almost like it's a U-shape composition, right? So you have figures piling up along the left-hand border, figures piling up along the right-hand border, and in the center, past the central figures that are the focus, we see through to a landscape that opens in the distance. And when we read other people who wrote about making paintings at the time, one of the things they mention is this is the right way to lay out a picture. Right? Carl van Mander said that in his book from 1604 on how to paint, right? Now, what's important about this for Rembrandt? One is Lastman's focus on human interaction. Right? This is John the Baptist preaching to his followers, and for a Protestant country, it's less important sort of the heavens opening up and all of that than it is a story of human interchange. Human exchange. So we see the kids climbing up on the rock, people in various poses listening to him, the fellow leaning on his hand behind the Baptist, or another one in front of him with a very similar, thoughtful, somewhat melancholic pose. I say that because there's a tradition of images of leaning on your hand like that is melancholy, right? But a whole range of figures that are interested in what the Baptist has to say, and they use their Lasman is really good at using body poses to communicate human interaction, gestures. Just the way in which they hold their body is really one of his strengths as a painter. Add to that costume, I love that horse, right, looking straight out at us. I brought him in instead of the dog, even, right? Give him my druthers. But these wonderful gestures and poses throughout that enliven the composition on the one hand, but on the other hand, very much engages on a human level. Right? Add to that, another thing that's really important for Rembrandt is costuming. How part of telling a biblical story is coming up with inventive fantasy costumes that evoke the idea of far-off lands. Right? They're not archaeologically accurate or anything like that, but the idea is that they are there specifically to evoke far-off lands. Here with the gestures, right, of the different facial features of the figures. As I was looking at this picture, I began to think to myself that all of a sudden, I was like, man, I've seen some of these guys before, right? And lo and behold, what we're going to find is that this stay with Lastman stayed with Rembrandt, if that makes sense. In other words, he's with Lastman for about 18 months. I'll get you in a second, Monica. He stayed with Lastman for about 18 months, but the experience had a profound impact. And what I think you could do if you took the time is you could go through the rest of Rembrandt's career and trace figures and body types and poses and gestures and costumes back to Lastman's work. Absolutely profound impact on Rembrandt, right? And then keep in mind, right, he's a 16-year-old, right? There. Monica.
I was just an observation that I was going to say it's interesting hearing the background to this because the character that you zoomed in on, it's almost, for me, it was almost like comical, displaying, now knowing that he's displaying his like expertise in body.
Right.
Posing, because some of it like genuinely gives that feel of like a realness to the painting, like especially I think the little boy in the left hand corner.
He's terrific, isn't he? A little purple and green kid.
That's exactly what a kid would do.
Yeah.
Sit like that and turn like that. But just him on that little horse just seems like that's so uncomfortable, and you wouldn't be sitting like that.
Yeah. But he's leaning in, right? I mean, it adds that sense of sort of you got to do what you can to hear what the Baptist has to say, right? Because he's the prophet,
right,
and
in comparison to like the trees don't really look that realistic, but like their body movements do, and then he's kind of like really going.
That's kind of an interesting thing you bring up because one of the things we talk about so much with Dutch art is the extraordinary sense of realism, and one of the things I think that is interesting about that is that the whole realm of history painting tends to be so much more stagey and artificial, and doesn't have some of the, like your picture, it's got so much naturalism to it. It's just so like snapshot realism, right? That when we get these things that are posed, and part of what Lastman's doing with this figure, this composition, in addition to sort of telling the biblical story, and it's about, right, remember, it's about like yay, right? It's a mid-sized picture. Some of his are much, much larger than that. But on a certain level, one of the reasons that history paintings were valued was the degree to which it required various levels of artistic skill, in particular with the human figure. And as you look at that group in the foreground, right, running all the way from your cute little kid to the guy in the doctoral robes, right, to the woman with the purple and the periwinkle and the coral color, right? Or the figure that's leaning next to her. There's something about the way, last one you said showing off, and I think that's exactly right, that he's knitting together this group of figures in this extraordinary range of poses and reactions and interactions, right? That is itself virtuosic, right? He's not posing 20 people to paint this. He's doing figure studies, and he's going, okay, I'm going to put this hand over here, and knitting everything together, and then coming back and coloring it, right? And that's kind of something we don't talk as much about, but one of the things we see when we look at early Rembrandt is this sort of local color, right? So the way Lastman colors is the guy on the left is wearing red, and there's a beautiful red, and the kid is wearing purple and green. But there's a sense that everybody's sort of been, it's a black and white figure that's been filled in. Does that make sense? Right? The colors don't seem to sort of waft through the atmosphere so much as they're located, like the Sunday comics, in someone's. So right now, John, right, your green top is slightly blue on this side and slightly yellow on that side because of the way the light in the room is, right? And over and above that, on the wall next to you, some of the green coming off of your shirt hits that wall because the light hits it, right? That just happens. And that's the way color works, right? And very atmospheric. But there's nothing really atmospheric about Lastman. It's very illustrative, right?
It reminds me of, one that Leonardo Last Supper, where that every grandma has in their house.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
And which I did not realize was the Leonardo da Vinci didn't go like far too ways. But that's neither here nor there. But it also reminds me of like pictures that you would see in like a children's illustrated Bible.
Yeah, that's a simple clarity, right? I think that's a key part, and also the humanizing of it, right? Because that's something we would see now as well. I think these are all the reasons now that when we look at Dutch art of the 17th century, we tend to ignore history painting on the norm, because it's just kind of, yeah, okay, there's Baroque history painting, same old everywhere you look. So those are both very good observations on this, right? So there's the Baptist. Now, like I said, I was looking at this thing, and I look at the guy in green and brown at the foot of the Baptist, and this pose goes back to there's a print by Dürer. Albrecht Dürer is a German printmaker called Melancholia. That we think maybe he originally intended to do each of the four major temperaments of mankind, but melancholy, sadness, right? And it's called Melancholia 1, no less, right? But there isn't 2, 3, and 4, right? There's not Sanguine 2, right, or anything like that. Phlegmatic, the other ones. But Melancholia was kind of an important temperament because artists tended to have it, because it was the temperament that was controlled by the god Saturn. Right? Saturn controls creativity, but creativity can knot you up, right? So anyway, this melancholic figure that Lascaux has leaning on his hand, with his face cast in shadow, no less, right? That adds to the melancholy side of that. I've seen him, and it just dawned on me as I was looking at this that this is now 25 years after Rembrandt's in the Lascaux shop. And we saw this, I think, when we were there. We saw at least one print. I talked to somebody on the trip about this, the 100 Guilder print, right? One of Rembrandt's most beloved prints, and certainly one where he's showing off on a certain level. His ability to make a print that has all of the tonal range of a painting, right? From sketchiness to deeply, deeply crosshatched, right? But look at Jesus and compare him to the Baptist. And then look here. That guy right there. You see him down there? Leaning on his hand right at the feet of Jesus. Now, this is when Christ says, "Suffer the little children, come unto me," right? Matthew, was it 19? Something like that. And this is the rich young man who can't figure out if he's going to give all of his wealth up to follow Jesus. That inspires Christ to say it is harder for a rich man to get into heaven than it is for a camel to get through the eye of a needle, right? So this is the rich young man who's been commanded by Jesus to give up all of his wealth and follow me. And he's saying, I don't know if I can do that, right? But that pose and even Jesus' pose, I think, is a memory of last month. 25 years later still. Yeah.
So I remember seeing that and I wish I could remember which museum it was in, where you had the painting of the priests and the pagans all gathered in a circle, most of them naked, and they all had that same exact pose.
Really? Was it one of the Rembrandts, or was it, do you remember?
I don't think it was a Rembrandt, but
Huh. Yeah.
I want to say it was maybe in the Moritz house.
Okay.
But when I saw that, I was wondering whether that sort of pose was meant to mean, oh well, because these are pagans, so maybe they're apathetic, or they're bored, and they're meant to be like not paying attention.
Or depressed by what they're hearing is the other option, right? Because they're hearing something. I get a feeling it might be a Rembrandt. It might be the Simeon's Song of Praise, which is in the Moritz house, of Christ being presented to the priest Simeon, and there's some bunch of Sanhedrin sort of sitting on the side there. Was it a print or a painting?
I don't think Christ was in the painting. It was
So
just
it was a
like
baby
priests missionizing.
Oh, interesting. Well, yeah, I mean, what's important to remember, then this is the whole idea of the next step, is to think about the degree to which conventions color the way in which we interpret things, right? They're very much based on conventions. So I wish I could see the picture. I would know better, right?
See if I can find
Yeah, and then I don't know. I don't know where this picture was in 1650, but he includes a cute little dog wants to play fetch, right? I love that. He's got a little bone laying on the ground. He's like looking at the bone to play fetch. And Lastman's got a dog that seems to be interested in something other than the words of the Baptist, right? So Lastman, right, is this extraordinarily important figure for Rembrandt. And years after having been in Lastman's studio, Rembrandt is picking up on ideas from this experience, right? So in the Rembrandt house is the Triumph of Mordecai from the Book of Esther. And here's Rembrandt's print of the same scene, again 25 years or so later. Another great dog, by the way, barking, so we can hear these pictures, right? And did we talk about the story of this in this class? What happened with the story of Mordecai? Yeah, right. How Haman is forced to lead his arch enemy through the streets dressed as a king, right? And in each of these, I mean, the figure of Haman is really similar, isn't it? The one leading the horse, even though we've reversed the direction of the horse. And I think that would be a wonderful study to figure out how does Rembrandt remember Lastman 25 years later, right? Is it just, did he make sketches? We know he bought lots of art, Rembrandt did. He had a huge art collection. And he was working not only as a painter, but also as a dealer, so in art. Having just come back from Amsterdam, not the other kind of dealer. And does he own Lastmans? I would have to go back and look at the inventory from when he went bankrupt in '56 to find out, right? So lots of impact from Lastman on Rembrandt's work. One of the things that Lastman also gives Rembrandt is this basis in works from the 16th century. Lastman is deeply interested in another painter from Leiden, a painter, printmaker named Lucas van Leyden from the early part of the 16th century. And Rembrandt eventually goes on to collect prints by Lucas. And he seems to have gotten that interest in Lucas van Leyden from Lastman. So Lastman has this sort of extraordinary impact, right? So Rembrandt's there for like 18 months, 22 to 24 or so. And in 1624, he goes back to Leiden. Now he's trained under two different painters, mid-20s, he's 18 years old. He's going to start his career as a painter in Leiden. And at the exact same time he goes there, he begins to share a studio with another young painter who's about a year younger than he is, named Jan Lievens, Lievens. And they seem to share a significant amount of things in common. He and Lievens. I'm a bit ahead of myself here. So what does he get from Lastman before we leave Lastman behind, right? Importance of history painting, right? Remember his ambition to be a great painter. Telling biblical stories in human terms, right? Really important lesson from Lastman. Almost comical, right, or comic book-like. The importance of costuming to make it lively, right? Artistic traditions deriving from conventions, in particular Lucas van Leyden, who was a great storyteller from the early 16th century. These things are all important lessons he gets from Lastman, right? And I always have this tendency to overprove points, right? But Rembrandt it hits him right away. It's not just like he's recalling it 25 years later, right? He gets this stuff. He sees the one on your right from the Moritz house was painted. It's on loan to Leiden because it's too big to fit in the Moritz house. But this was painted during Rembrandt's stay in Lastman's studio, and so here, shortly after coming out, or at the end of the decade, is Rembrandt's variation on exactly this same theme. Right? Now, like I said, he begins to become an artist. He shares a studio with Jan Lievens. They have an extraordinary back and forth. Right? Lievens and Rembrandt in the studio together, mid 1620s to around 1630, is one of these great artistic partnerships, right? And I say partnership broadly. I don't mean it business-wise, so much as I mean a dialogue between these two painters that is just extraordinary, right? Taking ideas and obviously feeding on each other and playing with the same themes and ideas, right? And it's, for the longest time, Lievens was this artist that was there when Rembrandt was getting started, and then he kind of just goes off and becomes a portrait painter, and everybody thinks he's boring. But he is emerging anymore as having as important a role in Rembrandt's development as Lastman did, even though he's younger. First, Lievens had been to Amsterdam before Rembrandt ever went, right? Lievens had actually studied under Lastman as well, but he was there before Rembrandt was, right? Now, Rembrandt and Lievens don't start sharing a studio till both of them are done apprenticing under Lastman. But Leiden is a small town, and they're within a year of each other as young artists. They probably knew each other from a very early time, right? And it may well have been, I don't think there's any proof for this, but we can't rule out the fact that Lievens' apprenticeship under Lastman inspired Rembrandt to do the same. Because Lievens got back about a year before Rembrandt took off. And Lievens seems to very much pick up on Lastman in the same way that Rembrandt does. We cannot discount the fact that he plays a pretty important role in all of this, right? The other thing about Lievens that's quite important for Rembrandt is that Lievens started getting into those Utrecht painters, the Caravaggio followers, in advance of Rembrandt. Yet we know that that group of painters was what made Rembrandt shift from a Lastman coloring book aesthetic to a more moody use of light for drama and effect, and a more limited color palette, right? Those things come out of the Utrecht group. And it was Lievens that got into that group before Rembrandt did, right? So Lievens is bigger than we've really given him credit for. It's only in the last 10 years or so that people are starting to wake up and realize that Lievens is kind of, it's odd. We say he's more important than that, but we still talk about him as he's important because he influenced Rembrandt, rather than just in his own right. There was a big show at the NGA less than 10 years ago about Lievens, right? But he's pretty terrific. And in addition to that, he and Rembrandt start etching at about the same time as well. My Wi-Fi is going slowly. Let's try that again. There we go. Right? Same theme. There. Same theme in printmaking in the hands of both artists. And you can see, just as we had in the paintings, the hands are coming out with Lievens, whereas Rembrandt's got the body coming up and the figures. But they're taking their own compositions and working them through in multiple media at the same time. So Lievens and Rembrandt become early 1620s, this really important sort of pairing of artists, right? Nice portrait of Rembrandt by Lievens, right? So, late 20s, Rembrandt and Jan Lievens are sharing a studio together, right? And Lievens seems to be a major influence on Rembrandt's shift away from Lastman's coloring style to this sort of Caravaggio-influenced umber tone sort of style that we see in this portrait of Rembrandt by Lievens, right? It's during this period that Huygens visits them, Constantine Huygens, and he's a very important patron for both of them, an important connection. And for Rembrandt, as an artist who's interested in status, Huygens is an absolutely crucial figure, right? Sets him up, makes connections for him. Huygens had been the part of the court of the Stadtholder, the stateholder, Prince Moritz, right? And following him, Frederick Hendrik. And here's Leavens' portrait of him. We saw the other portrait in the Moritz house of him with his wife, right, by Jacob van Kampen later. But he visits Leavens and Rembrandt in the 20s while they're sharing a studio around the time Leavens paints this portrait and comments on their talent. Right? He really likes what they're doing. And he says that they're probably the most talented people working in art in Holland at the time. And he's also the one that encourages them to go to Italy to study the great art of Italy, at which point we had this comment from Rembrandt that he doesn't need to because he can find everything he needs up here in collections and sales and whatnot, right? But the two of them are sort of hooked at the hip, Rembrandt and Leavens are, in the late 1620s, and doing very, very similar things in different places. So both of them are very much interested in doing head studies that they can use for their religious pictures, posing people for pictures. The relationship between these and the finished pictures, this is an interesting thing about Rembrandt in general, but both Rembrandt and Leavens. During the Renaissance, you would make studies for paintings where you would work out the details of a portion of the painting, first in a drawing and then in a small oil sketch. And that would lead directly to the finished product, right? So in Alex's room at the Rijksmuseum, there was on the far wall a picture of a still life with the man and there was a monkey in it, and right next to it was a study of the monkey. Do you remember that or not? That's the normal way of working. But for Rembrandt, and this is a fascinating thing about Rembrandt, right? For this 1,000+ drawings we have by him, and all of the small scale studies, like the one on your right, precious few of them lead directly to a bigger composition. When Rembrandt's making studies, he's not making studies as trying to work out the kinks so that he can do the finished picture better. He's making studies so that he becomes a better painter, better with the human figure. And one of the most fascinating things about Rembrandt's work in 3 different media, painting, printmaking, and drawing, is with that roughly 2,000 images to work with, right? How few one-to-one correspondences there are between the 3, right? He doesn't. Whereas in the Renaissance, right, the tradition had been in the Renaissance that if you wanted to Michelangelo's going to make the Sistine ceiling, he will do studies of each individual figure, right? And he will work it up through stages and and each drawing will lead us to the final thing eventually. But that's not how Rembrandt works, right? It's not really how Jan Leavens works. There might be the same figure showing up in more than one, but the head study, the Trony, isn't a one-to-one study for a figure in a painting somewhere else. It just doesn't work that way. And the same thing holds true for the drawings. And every now and then you can see him taking a print and saying, okay, I'm going to make a reproduction of something. But it's the rarity. Usually what he's doing is he's looking at something he's done in one media, saying, okay, there's some possibilities I want to work out more fully, right, that I can do in this medium. And the drawings are really kind of ends to themselves. The etchings are ends to themselves. Even some of the smaller sketches are, in the long run, ends to themselves. But what they make Rembrandt able to do is to do expression, right? They make him very able to render human form, right, in an engaging and expressive way. Right? So our Laughing Man, right, that's all it is. It's not a portrait. It's a head study with the idea of getting better at expression. Right? What's interesting about looking at these works from the two of them, Rembrandt and Levens, is not only the similarity in style, tonality. You can even see Levens is doing what we were so amazed that Rembrandt did, of turning the brush around backwards and scratching through to get the hair and the beard, right? Which Rembrandt's doing in this much smaller image on your right, in the Moritz house. There's not only that, the tonality, but they're both using the same models as well, and you'll see them back and forth appear in these things. So those of you who are in Amsterdam, I asked you to look for Rembrandt's mom. You can find her in Levens' pictures too, right? They're sharing models while they're working together, and they're not. It'd be great if we could see the same model from two different sides, so they're both painting at the same time. But I don't think it works out that way. Right? So Rijksmuseum, there's a Levens picture of an old woman reading, and Rembrandt, Rijksmuseum, is that the same woman? Ostensibly, maybe, right? Sort of flattened nose, right? Roughly the same age, very much the same theme. This is this idea of them being sort of joined at the hip, right? They're working with ideas so closely with one another, right? I had mentioned when we were abroad other instances where this happens. And it's a fascinating thing when it does. Picasso with Braque around 1906, 1907. Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg around 1960 in New York, right? The kind of extraordinary cross-pollination or fertilization that you get when you get two artists who are very much symbiotic in their interests and their productions. And Rembrandt and Levens is extraordinary, this back and forth. So our old woman reading by Levens on the left, I think that's her as well in Tobit and Anna with the kid. On the right, it looks very much like we're using the same model. And we think it's Rembrandt's mom because Rembrandt had to give up all of his plates at one point in the 1650s or 40s. He had to give up all of his etching plates. Money problems. And the person who got them is the one who said this is Rembrandt's mom. So we think that Rembrandt said that's my mom. That's my dad, right? But we don't necessarily have proof other than to see the degree to which these characters appear and reappear in each of their works, right, at this time, because they are so closely joined, right? So our Jeremiah lamenting, is that the same guy as Tobit and Anna on the right, as Levens was painting before, as appears in prints from the same time by both Levens and Rembrandt? These characters reappear, and they're not making the prints as studies for these things. They're not making the drawings as studies for these things. What they're doing is they're filling up their mind with visual references that can then come out at the drop of a hat. I wonder if Simeon, here, right, there's Simeon's Song of Praise. So this is Jesus now presented to the blind priest Simeon in the temple. And there's Mary in blue, right? And the priest on your right looking up to the light of heaven. But that kind of looks like the same guy again, right? They just seem to be appearing and reappearing everywhere we look. So Rembrandt comes out of this, right? Fertile relationship with Levens. Understanding something else, I think, that he maybe didn't get from last month. And that's the idea that every idea, every inspiration has multiple avenues that you can use to work from that same inspiration, right? And one of the things that we see Rembrandt do with themes that he likes, such as the presentation in the temple. That's what this is. They call it Simeon's Song of Praise, but it's just Christ being presented in the temple, and the particular moment when Simeon sings praises to God, having seen the Messiah, right? Having witnessed the Messiah. praises God for the opportunity to do what he's waited his entire life to do. But it's Christ presented in the temple. And that sequence of images includes everything from, the initial presentation, 2 turtle doves and all of that, to the circumcision, which is all part of that sequence of action. Right? It's just where you choose to put it within that. Okay, so now this particular one is that particular moment. But Rembrandt understands from having worked with Levens that there's inspiration to be found in other creations. Not just in the world around you, but in other works of art can be the launching pad. Right? Can be the springboard to original reconsiderations of the theme that allow you to do things you hadn't thought of the first time through. Right? To play with it a little bit and emphasize things. And so we find in themes that Rembrandt loves, like the presentation of the temple, that he will take the theme and just keep reworking it in different media. Right? So here's a fairly early etching when he's still pretty squiggly in his working, and the plate itself has some. I love how it looks as if he's sort of maybe even traced a drawing, because all those dot lines for the floor tiles, right? As if he sort of tapped in where it's going to be, and you can see the overall layout is somewhat similar, but he's turned some of the figures around, and Simeon's facing toward us, and the figures. It's the same idea, but reconsidered. Right? And that's exactly what I think working with Levens sort of gave to Rembrandt, was that idea of constantly searching, right? Never being happy. Okay, I've done the presentation. I'm done with that now, right? And this is my favorite one because this is the same sequence of action, and now Jesus is getting his circumcision and screaming like a little baby, right? Unlike many of these scenes where Jesus seems to be taking it very calmly. But in fact, this is a very, very realistic scene told in quite human terms. And so, again, the Levens experience, when Rembrandt finally moves to Amsterdam, sort of sticks with him. That a good idea is never done, right? Now, toward this end, he makes quite a few head studies. We already saw one from Levens as well. It's not that Levens introduced him to this, but many artists in the 17th century who are interested in doing history paintings will do costume studies. And they're intended specifically, they look like portraits, but they're not, right? They are intended to be studies of costume and expression. And sometimes these faces will reappear in etchings of the same subject matter, but he's making these all along. And again, the term we use for these are tronies, right? And the idea is, of course, that now Rembrandt's done. He's a mature artist. He's in his mid-20s. He's moved back to Amsterdam, 1630-31. He moves to Amsterdam, right? He wants to make it. He has ambition. He's going to be the greatest darn painter they've ever heard of in forever. Right? Now, by the 21st century, he's kind of succeeded, right? But not so much at the time. And so what he wants to do is become a history painter. So he begins to paint these tronies. There was a market for them. People would want these because they're beautifully painted, right? Jewels, luxury, plus the paint. Something we'll talk a lot about tonight is the paint. And Rembrandt is extraordinary, right? There is a market for these, but Rembrandt's primary personal purpose in doing them is to again arm himself, right? He's filling his quiver with arrows. He's beefing up his visual arsenal so that when he wants to do an image of the circumcision and he wants some Middle Eastern-like figure, right, it comes out of his pen, comes out of his brush, without even having to pose anybody. At the same time, we know he was collecting costumes, right? He had trunks full of costumes in his house that he could dress people up with at will. Now, with these figures, because they're so realistic, because they're so individualized, there's always the question of whether or not they are intended as portraits, per se. Is this a portrait of a man in Oriental dress, or is it a trony study of a man in Oriental dress? And with these two, we're pretty sure they're not portraits, but we don't have any smoking gun, right? There's no perfect proof on that. Two more, right? The Noble Slav up in New York. It's a 6-foot picture. It's huge. Like, he's over life size. The Noble Slav is, right? He looks down on you from well above your head level. But again, seems to be just a trony, just a study, right? Not a portrait. The one on the left, there was a Polish ambassador that visited Amsterdam in 1637, later owned a Rembrandt portrait of himself. Is this him? Is it another trony? There's sometimes that the line gets blurred, right, between them, and we simply don't have enough information on that, right? So at this point in his career, right, Rembrandt's moved to Amsterdam, early 1630s, and as we heard at the Monica didn't just hear that, but the rest of us heard at the Rembrandt house, he goes to work for a dealer, an art dealer, Hendrik van Aulenberg. He goes into business with him. Now, it's not a partnership. He's one of probably a dozen artists working for Aulenberg. And Aulenberg's an art dealer, but instead of just buying and reselling, he's cutting out the profit margin by hiring artists to make paintings for him to sell. The artist will get an income, right? A steady income for doing this. But the paintings are Aulenberg's to sell, right? And Rembrandt goes into a relationship with him. It's a good way to have a steady income, right? And these can be anything from history pictures to portraits, right? You'd walk into Aulenberg's shop and say, I want him. And Rembrandt pretty quickly outdistances the other talent there, right? Becomes very much in demand, working for Hendrik van Aulenberg. Van Aulenberg's shop is immediately adjacent to the house that Rembrandt will eventually buy in 1639. Right? So the Van Aulenberg collection is important for a couple things. One is helping to establish Rembrandt's career, it's helping to spread his fame. But he also meets Aulenberg's cousin, Saskia, who he marries. So this business relationship turned into a personal relationship for Rembrandt. His first wife, Saskia, was the cousin of Hendrik van Aulenberg, his business partner. And unlike a lot of relationships prior to the 20th century, they were deeply in love. I mean, there's just everything that, all the records of their relationship suggest that they were just, it wasn't just a business arrangement, which you might expect if he's marrying into his boss's family, right? They were deeply, deeply in love. And there's sort of no proof otherwise. I mean, he doesn't write love letters to her or anything like that, but just looking at the number of images of her that he's painting. Although he's always painting the people around him, right? So here are two images of Saskia where she's a trony again, right? It's just a study of costuming, because you need more than just the guys for your biblical pictures. So he dresses her up in costumes that really don't exist. That's why we call them fantasy costumes. They don't follow the norm of the day. That wonderful one from the National Gallery, just a terrific, the diaphanous veil over her head, and a sort of brighter, frumpier one from the Rijksmuseum, right? But she's everywhere in his work in the 30s. So Saskia just appears and reappears in his work, and often sort of dressed up in these costumes, right? Whether in printmaking or in painting, that are again arming him for other kinds of works, but at the same, but also have a market of their own, right? I don't know if I've shown you guys this one yet. This is my favorite Rembrandt. This one's in Dresden. And it's one of these things where it's a Trony of sorts, but he sort of pushed it a step further and turned it into a biblical image. It's a prodigal son wasting his dad's money, we think, right? But it's also Rembrandt with Saskia on his lap, right? And there's our big turkey pie with the handle coming toward us, like we saw in so many other still lives, right? Signs of decadent overindulgence. And Rembrandt with that, that's your cup, Monica, right, from your picture, the drinking cup, with the lines around the outside of it, and enjoying the heck out of himself. And Saskia, who comes from money, right? She was really wealthy, and her family was very well-to-do. She brought a huge dowry to Rembrandt, right? So big that there was 17th century equivalent of a prenup, that if anything happened to their relationship, he had to pay it back. That any of the money that he got from her would stay in her family. He couldn't take it with him. So if she were to die before him, it would go to his son, right? And if it didn't, and he remarried, he would have to repay the family, the entire dowry. And as it turns out, he was a profligate spender and ended up deeply in debt. And when Saskia did eventually die, he was unable to ever remarry because of the trust, right? So anyway, just this scene of the, this is just a terrific picture, right? So Rembrandt's really riding high, right? He's at the top of his game here in the 1630s. He's becoming increasingly successful, right? Not only is he beginning to make a career working for Hendrik van Allenberg in the early 1630s as a portrait and history painter, but he's married up the social ladder, right? And this is going to bring him more and more money. He also then begins to get his own students. By the mid-1630s, he begins to teach as well. And these are two drawings by Rembrandt pupils showing Rembrandt teaching. Right? So both from the nude model, but you can also see casts on the shelves. That's Rembrandt in the center with the book on his lap. Right? And each one he's got the book rested on his knee. Right? So up above, and you can see these are almost like the same group of people, aren't they? Some of them in the same position even. The old man with the glasses, a figure kneeling in the corner, Rembrandt with the book on his knee. We've just changed the position of the model somewhat in the two of them, right? But this also begins to bring Rembrandt increasing amounts of financial stability and wealth, right? Is that he's taking on students, and he takes them on in the same way that he had the relationship with Hendrik. So Allenberg's running a studio. Students, he was working for Allenberg, right? Allenberg could then sell his paintings. Rembrandt's pupils worked for Rembrandt. He could sell their paintings as well. And it was perfectly legal and not at all unethical for Rembrandt to sign them as the result of him teaching them. And this has caused a lot of problems for us when it comes to attributing Rembrandt's works. Right? So look at two more pictures and we'll take a break. One of the things that Rembrandt did as a teacher was to have his students copy his compositions. Right? So as part of what you would do as an apprentice, right, you'd start with the really menial jobs, grinding pigment, mixing up oil paints for the day, right, because they didn't have tubes, right? Mixing up the paint for the day, priming the canvas, stretching it on the trapeze, right, cleaning up the studio, just the grunt work. That's what you'd start with. Then you would move your way up the ladder. You'd start to do drawings, and you'd work first from model or from casts, right? From plaster casts or statues. You'd move from there to working from the model. To eventually, one of the last things you would do is you would try to copy the master's style. Before, you went out on your own, and instead of copying the master's style, formulated your own direction. Right, this is a step in that direction. So, Hovard Flink, in the Royal Palace, he was one of the artists that was working in the Royal Palace. Very much, fairly directly copying Rembrandt's work. Alec, you had your hand up.
Oh, it just kind of dawned on me. So, do you think the reason then why some of these masters were able to be so prolific is because they didn't have to do all that crap?
All of the
They could-
grunt
they
work
could
and
walk
the
into their studio and
walk in
everything's
and everything's ready for
them.
them. Yeah, it also really highlights to us, I think, what an amazing innovation the little steel tube of paint must have been, right? Because if you think about the other thing is that of course you can't paint outside, right? It's absolutely impossible to go outside to paint because they're mixing it for you and it dries out and they're going to give it to you in a little bowl, right? And they might have had pig's bladder sacks, but those only last so long, right? Before the oil seeps through that. A limitation there must have been on the artist. I think that's the important thing from what you're saying is that extraordinary limitations on the artist based on the pragmatics of the studio practice, right? How important that was. Yeah. You're on something, Megan.
No, I was he's trying his best. You can tell.
But it's just
It's just not quite there.
it's just not.
Like, the guy that is that Mary? I mean,
Which one?
the one in the blue.
Oh yeah.
Did you ever see that where they paid a woman to do the restoration of the
Yeah.
cat picture and it looks awful?
It was Jesus. There was that.
It was
It was Span. It was
Jesus.
that. It was that fresco of Jesus in Spain.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a little bit like Fresco Jesus. And the
I'll tell you where he's good is the face of Christ, though.
yeah,
Right
that's that Thomas is very much like is that Thomas
on the right.
on the right.
Yeah.
He's much more effeminate than just the way he's standing
Yeah.
in place, which is a little strange. It
Yeah.
just makes the whole tone of the
It has
like,
it has its moments, though. You know, the guy behind Thomas's hip is all right. You know, it's got its moments.
Very hit or miss.
Yeah, that's right. And I think part of that, Megan, is what we see in the Rembrandt, is what I've been talking about all along, which is that, okay, so the figure of Thomas looks like that flat-nosed old man that we've seen in other Rembrandt pictures. He's got this repertoire of figures in the back of his head, right? I don't think he's whipping out drawings to make this work. He's got these figures in the back of his head. He knows gestures, right? Look at how effective the gesture of the figure standing up from the chair on the right-hand side. In Rembrandt, and it's the exact same pose in Flink, but it just doesn't have the sense of arrested movement, right? It's much more posy and stagey. The whole Rembrandt pupil thing it's massive. We have quite a few works now that are attributed to Rembrandt pupils, and he kept a huge number of pupils through his entire career. So two more, right? One from the Rembrandt house and the original from elsewhere. A somewhat, I think, better, if you will, than Hovard Flink. Ferdinand Boll, right? Doing this exact same thing, doing exact copies of Rembrandt works. This is part of Rembrandt's teaching practice, right? So he is sort of really there, right? He's arrived, if you will, by the mid-1630s. Let's take a break, and we'll wrap up Rembrandt after the break.